And I want to frame my my comments this morning really around the importance of our work, the utility of our research and agency, but I really want to frame it in a way that is mindful of the recent loss that we had with Congressman John Lewis, who was a civil rights icon, someone who was definitely an agitator for justice, someone who was on the path for creating the kind of society that we all want. And what I really appreciated was the fact that many of us had the honor and the opportunity to meet Congressman Lewis when he came to the UCLA campus a couple of years ago. And I was one of those individuals. And I cannot say that you will not find a more humble individual than he was, a more gracious, a more giving, a more considerate individual. And so part of what I really appreciate about John Lewis is that he talked about us getting out there and pushing and standing up and speaking out and getting in the way that in the same way that his generation got in the way. And he says get in the way in a manner that is around getting in trouble. And he called it good trouble. And he talked about necessary trouble. And I want to frame my comments with you today to have you think about your research and your inquiry in a way that is centered on good trouble, that's centered on necessary trouble. And I raise that because I think in so many ways, what we need to understand is that the research and inquiry that we engage in has some serious, and I do mean serious, implications for how our society unfolds. I say that because in so many ways, much of the ways we understand the world today, discoveries, innovations, all are a byproduct of research and inquiry. People who brought ideas, people who had questions, people who were curious, people who wanted change, people who wanted to think about different ways of how we understood social, political, economic phenomenon. And so I ask you, as you engage in your research, to not do research for the sake of just doing research because it's the end thing to do, or to not do research because others are saying something that you should think about doing. Do research because you want to help to create new understandings. Do research because you want to help us to begin to develop an awareness around issues that we have not understood before. Do research because you want to help bring about change and transformation into communities that have oftentimes been overlooked and underserved. But I would argue with you, and I would really ask you to think about getting involved in research because you want to do good trouble, necessary trouble. We have a multitude of challenges in the world before us, and I want to make sure that everything we do is trying to help us to create a more just, inclusive, and humane society. And I want to say this. I've had the good fortune of being at UCLA for 20 years. And I've had the honor and the opportunity to work with dozens and dozens of McNair scholars over that time. And I must say that you are some of the most intellectually gifted, some of the most transformative, some of the most thoughtful young scholars that we have. And you all are part of a larger community, a larger fabric. And I want to say that what you're doing is difference making. So I want to thank all of you out there for being amazing, for being thoughtful, for taking your time to invest in this process. I've had the honor of talking to a number of McNair scholars just in the past couple of weeks, and several of them talked about the fact that it's a lot of work and it's time consuming and it's hard at times and it's difficult at times. But let me tell you this, that time, that commitment, that sacrifice that you are making into this process will yield you some significant dividends. I say that because I have the honor to be able to sit on lots of admissions committee for graduate programs, and you can tell a McNair scholar when that application comes across your computer. You can see how well prepared that particular individual is, how thoughtful, how thorough their applications are, how concise, how tight, how probing their statement of purposes are. You can tell a McNair scholar. So I told those individuals I spoke to in the last few weeks the same thing I'm going to tell you now. It makes a difference, this program, because you are so much farther ahead of the curve compared to those who have not had the opportunities that you've had. The mentorship that you received has been really, really, really priceless. So I want to give another shout out to all the amazing mentors who work with McNair scholars, because you all do phenomenal work in getting our scholars ready to be competitive for graduate programs across the entire spectrum. So all the work you're doing, it will pay off. I know it's tiring. I know it's time consuming. I know it's not always fun and exciting, but when you get those acceptances, when you get those fellowships, and when you get those opportunities to go and do your graduate work, you will see that it will all be worth it. So I just want to say that, and I want to say thank you for what you do. So let me frame my conversation around why research matters and why we have to have a certain type of conviction to doing something different. If you look at the ways that research has been played out historically in these United States of America, they have not always been kind. They have not always been accurate. They have not always been thoughtful, thorough, and its portrayal around people of color. And research, historically speaking, has not always been thoughtful around communities of color. And if you look historically in social sciences, if you look historically in the humanities, if you look historically in biological sciences, we will see that the ways in which communities and people of color have oftentimes been very negative, where we see folks of color and communities of color have been portrayed as pathological. We have been looked at as being crime-ridden. We have been situated as being deficit-based, seen as having no agency around our circumstances. Oftentimes, the ways in which research has sort of captured our realities has been sort of situated in the fact that there's been little resistance that we've offered to transform our communities. We've oftentimes been objectified, especially in some of the biological sciences, where we have been guinea pigs in the name of scientific improvement. We are often dehumanized in that same process. There is this larger narrative that has happened in the research literature for centuries that we have oftentimes been deemed as having lower levels of intelligence, uneducated, fractured families, and the list can go on and on and on. And what I need you to understand about these depictions around not just communities of color, but the same thing can be said about other marginalized populations, namely poor people, namely people of color, namely women, namely folks who are members of the LGBTQ plus community, and I can go on and on. And part of what I need you to understand is that much of these depictions have come in the name of research, in the name of science, where you had largely white men who engaged in research on about people of color, on about other marginalized populations, and really operated on seeing us through a very deficit lens, one that did not see our assets, research that did not see our resilience, research that did not really understand the circumstances and the conditions in which led to our communities being in the way that they were. So I need you to understand that research has played a huge role in the depiction and portrayal of communities of color through this deficit lens. And much in the way that it's played that role in placing us in that position, I think we have to play a role as researchers to begin to unpack and rechange and retransform the way in which we are seen. So to that end, I would say that we have to understand that what research has done historically is not looked at the larger ecosystem in which, let's say, communities of color have been in these United States. And it's an ecosystem that is built on systems of oppression. And what is oftentimes absent, or what is oftentimes missing from those historical portrayals of people of color and communities of color is the fact that we have had in this country of colonialism and its effects, racism and its pervasiveness, homophobia has been a staple in our society. Patriarchy has been a huge, huge oppressive force. Xenophobia has been sort of endemic to the very sort of framework of the United States. Sexism has been still an issue that we have not been able to somehow eradicate. Exploitation, and the list goes on. And so part of what I think doesn't happen in research is for there to be an explanation of why we see certain people in a particular light. To look at them devoid of the historical context, I think is irresponsible, and I think it's not good science. So part of what I would ask us to think about as we engage in our research is to make sure that we are creating a complete picture of the experiences, of the challenges, and the obstacles that many communities have had to face in these United States in their quest to be seen as being humane. So I use the ecosystem model for a moment because the ecosystem is important here, because the ecosystem tells us and helps us to understand sort of the health and the safety of all the different ingredients that help to make up a vibrant community. So to that end, I would help you to understand, I want you to understand that ecosystems matter, because as you all know, and lots of my McNair scholars who I hear who are biological scientists who study ecosystems, that these are defined areas in which a community lives and interacts and takes place with organisms between the community and its non-living physical environment. All these different factors play a role to help to create either a healthy or an unhealthy ecosystem. And I think when it comes to understanding research, frequently what is missing, as I said a moment ago, is that the ecosystem in which communities of color have oftentimes had to operate have not always been as advantageous as it has been for other communities. So I want us to begin to think about the ways in which we have to ask different questions. We have to use different methods. And I think we have to probe in ways that previous research has not, because our ecosystems matter. So to that end, let me show you a quick picture. And I would ask you, if you saw this ecosystem, how might you describe this ecosystem? Just upon a quick glance, you would see fish who appear to be thriving. You would see lots of coral. You see lots of green life. You would suggest that this would tell us that the fish are thriving because the ecosystem is healthy. The nutrients that are in the water are probably vibrant. The minerals that are part of the makeup of the ecosystem are conducive to the thriving of those fish. And the ability for these fish to thrive and these fish to be at their best is optimal because of the ecosystem in which they are situated. Ecosystems tell us a lot about living beings' abilities to thrive. So that's one ecosystem. And we would say those fish are doing well, not because they're not great fish, but because they're in an ecosystem that allows their development to be optimal. So let me go one step further. Let me show you another ecosystem. If I showed you this picture and I ask you, how would you describe this ecosystem? And then I would ask you a subsequent question, which would be, is the problem with all these fish who have obviously expired, is the problem the fish or is the problem the water? And I raise this as an analogy because oftentimes when we see widespread decay, we see widespread destruction, and we see widespread death and despair, there's a tendency to blame the people for not doing better things, not making better choices, not having greater resolve. And I would say, if you look at this picture here, what it would suggest to me is that the problem is not the fish. The problem is obviously in the ecosystem that these fish were trying to thrive in. Now, what happens in research historically is that we will see this and we will say, you know what, something must have been wrong with those fish. Because if those fish had just tried to swim a little harder, if those fish had just sort of fought a little harder, if those fish had just not given up so easy, perhaps they'd be alive. If those fish had not just been so willing to succumb to all the things in their ecosystem, they may not have succumbed. Some might even say if those fish, and we may have heard this one before, just pulled themselves up by the bootstraps, they would have been able to overcome whatever the challenges were. So we continue to blame the fish without stepping back and saying, you know what, maybe the fish aren't the problem. Maybe it's the ecosystem in which the fish were trying to thrive in that is the problem. I use that as an analogy to have us think about the way in which we understand and talk about our work as researchers, because far too long, the argument has been the reason why certain communities don't thrive well is because they don't pull themselves up by the bootstraps. They don't try as hard. They don't give as much effort. They're not as motivated. They don't have the talent. They don't have the intellect. And so there's this ongoing approach to blame the victim without looking at the larger ecosystem upon which people are trying to survive. Now, I would argue, if you look at this picture, the fact that these fish ultimately demised, it says nothing about those fish. In many ways, you can say it's amazing that those fish got to be as large as they are, given that ecosystem that they came from. It's amazing to see that many of them reach full maturity and full height and weight as fish, despite the fact that that ecosystem that they were in was largely problematic. So I'm asking us to stop blaming the victim as we think about our research and start beginning to blame and critique our ecosystem, because I think the ecosystems, if they're full of racism, if our ecosystems are full of sexism, if our ecosystem are in sort of tainted with patriarchy, homophobia, transphobia, if our ecosystems are not recognizing the kind of resilience and uncanny ability to survive despite all these obstacles in the ecosystem that try to kill us, I think the research that we do will continue to be largely problematic. So I think historically, the research that we have had to try to understand has been based off of this pathological notion of who people of color are, who communities of color are, and other marginalized populations. So to that end, I want us to think about how we shift and change the narrative. So to do that, I think we have to think about the current state of research and think about how we transform it to create what I would call a future state. And I ask us to think about, how do we tell a different story with our research? How do we offer a different narrative with the questions we ask? How do we offer a different portrayal of the very communities that have historically been marginalized, silenced, and rendered invisible? And I think the way we do that is by beginning to do the work that many of you are doing to this day. You all are the embodiment of us telling a different story. And so part of what I want us to think about with our research is, how do we create a more complete, affirming, and humane narrative of marginalized populations and communities. And I think we do this in lots of ways. But one of the ways I think we do that is through our research and inquiry. The questions we ask, the methods we use, the literature we access, all helps to build knowledge. And that's what I want us to think about. So how do we do that? I want to offer you 3 steps we can take to begin to create a different story. 3 approaches that I think are essential for you to continue to do your work as scholars so that we're no longer engaging in this literature base that is oftentimes pathological and deficit based when it talks about certain communities. So for us to do that, I think we have to come to Thomas Kuhn. And I want to reference Thomas Kuhn because as a graduate student over 25 years ago, my advisor had us read Thomas Kuhn. And Thomas Kuhn's work really opened my eyes because Thomas Kuhn talked about the structure of scientific revolutions. And what I remember taking away from Thomas Kuhn's work was he said that we come to points in our society where there's a need for what he called paradigm shifts, where the existing paradigms or the existing knowledge bases or the existing ways in which we understand people or community no longer fit. Those existing paradigms don't seem to be as accurate as they would need to be. And those paradigms seem to be old, antiquated, outdated, and really in some ways are positioning certain people in ways that are not quite true to their reality. So what he says is that in paradigm shifts, we become fed up with one of the existing paradigms and we say, you know what, something has to be said different. A story needs to be told in a different manner. We need to begin to have new discoveries. We need to begin to uncover realities that perhaps we've not heard before. So what he says that these 4 steps are part of the process. Facts are discovered, and we have different theories to try to explain facts and compete for a leading position. One generally accepted theory becomes the paradigm, and then quote unquote normal science follows. And all these different ideas begin to sort of reinforce this paradigm. But then oftentimes he says there's a crisis and there's some dissension there. And there's some sort of rumbling where people begin to say, wait a minute, this depiction of women as being somehow inferior to men doesn't quite add up. This depiction of brown folks and black folks being inferior to white folks doesn't quite add up. And this crisis occurs. And when this crisis occurs in the paradigm, there's a need for new facts, new theories to create the need for a new paradigm. And what I'm engaging you all in is the fact that I think many of you, most of you, hopefully all of you are helping us to create and establish new paradigms because largely existing paradigms have not thought about our experiences, have not talked about our history, and not have known the insights of the ways in which we show uncanny ability to survive in the face of really toxic ecosystems. So I need you to understand Thomas Kuhn's work because he says oftentimes we have to have a need for new paradigms, and new paradigms come about because we start to ask different questions, okay? So the 3 things I need you to do, I need you to, number 1, understand that I oftentimes tell my students that research is me search. So the first thing I need you to do as we think about these different paradigms is to be okay and to be comfortable with engaging in works that are relevant to you and the communities that you come from, the experiences that you had, or the very circumstances in which you survived in every single day. Now, I raise this point because in many ways, some people would say, well, you can't really do research on topics that are too close to you because if you do that, you're not going to be objective. And as a researcher, you have to be objective. And if you're too subjective, your research is not reliable, it's not credible. To me, all that's a bunch of BS. I think that all research is subjective. All research is tied to the questions that we're interested in, the subjects and participants we choose to engage in, the paradigms that we exist in, the kinds of sample size and analysis that we use. So all research has levels of subjectivity to it. So my argument and my ask of you is to think about research as me search. Research as me search is tied to the fact that I'll be willing to bet for many of you, not most of you who are McNair scholars, the questions and the topics that you're exploring, you're doing that because they have some relevance to your own life, either you, your family, your community, or the schools you were part of. And what I'm asking you to do is to be okay with that, is to lean into it, is to not have to feel as if you apologize because you are concerned about issues that are tied to the communities that you come from. I say this because for years, white men who were researchers have always looked at issues that were very near and dear to them, but they were looked at as objective. So why is it that women and folks of color can't engage in the same kind of research? So the thing I need you to do first is to lean into this idea of research as me search and the topics that are relevant to me, the topics that are near and dear to my heart, the issues that I care deeply about, the communities that I want to understand. I'm okay being someone who's going to do research on those areas, and I should not have to feel as if I can't do it. Part of what you know as researchers, there's the whole value of insider, outsider perspective, and there's a large body of research on that. I am still of the belief that people who are insiders to communities can tell us a very accurate and holistic, and I think credible and valid account of insider perspective than we get from outsider perspectives. Think about it this way for a minute. If someone was to do, let's say, an ethnographic study of your family, who would be better suited to do that work? Would you be best suited to tell that story as a person who's a member of that family? Or would you rely on someone who's a total outsider to come in and somehow try to tell your family's story? Now, that's not to say that the outsider wouldn't have a perspective, not to say that the outsider couldn't give us some really powerful insight, but I maintain that the insider perspective is most valuable. And I think part of the reason why we have these pathological accounts of certain communities in our country today is because we've allowed outsiders to tell our stories. We've allowed people who don't understand our cultural context, people who don't understand the ecosystem that we have to navigate every day to tell our stories. And I will argue this, that the minute you allow other people to be the authors of your narrative, you must be prepared for a narrative that's not going to be accurate and it's not going to reflect or represent you in the most positive and affirming light. So I think it's important for us to be the narrative creators. It's up to us to be the authors of our own work. And I think our research helps us to do that. So first thing I need you to understand, research is me search. So to that end, part of what the other component of item number one is to think about what are the issues, what are the problems, and what are the challenges that I care most about. I say that because if you take topics that you are really indifferent about, you're not going to be able to stay the course. If you take challenges that you really don't find to be all that intriguing or interesting, you're not going to be able to stay the course. When you go down this road as a researcher, you're going to spend countless hours reading, writing, thinking about these topics that you're choosing to do the work on. If you do not have a fundamental belief and a core desire to see somehow these issues becoming better, then you're not going to sustain the course. You are going to spend too much time on these topics. So if you're going to spend that much time, the thing that will get you through is to say, I care so deeply about this topic. I care about issues around medical disparities in our communities. I care deeply about why our communities are becoming, gentrified in ways that they have become for the past several decades. I care deeply about the educational inequities that seem to not be getting better. I want to understand more about what we can do to begin to address issues around mental health challenges in communities of color. I want to understand how we begin to look at the ways that technology has shaped the way in which we interact in our society today. Whatever your topic might be, care deeply about it, because your care and your conviction and your concern for it is what's going to see you through when you come through obstacles and setbacks along the way. So care deeply about the issues that you're going to tackle. The second thing I need you to do, I need you to understand that knowledge is power, and I need you to be well-read. I need you to understand that if you're going to do this research around topics that are near and dear to your heart, people are going to look for ways to criticize you, critique you, tear down your work, say your work is not valid, say it's not representative, say it's not generalizable. And so to that end, you have to begin to understand the ways in which your breadth and depth of knowledge is going to help to give you the kind of standing that you can make your claims on. And I maintain that we need critical and insightful research on a host of different areas, from education to medicine, psychology, social work, the arts, computer science, business, engineering, mental health, urban planning, history, chemistry, dentistry, the list goes on and on. So to me, no matter what your area of study is, there are some probing questions that must be asked. No matter what your discipline of inquiry is, there are issues I maintain around inequities that need to be uncovered. So part of what I don't want you to think is that, well, I'm in an area that doesn't really have equity issues, that doesn't really have sort of pathological notions. I would strongly disagree with that, because every field and every discipline in our society, I think, is oftentimes rife with inaccurate portrayals or exclusions of certain populations. Much of what we know is that many of the larger bodies of research that we are studying to this day were not done with people of color in mind. Many of the large studies that we are oftentimes asked to consume today did not have people of color as its participants. So the knowledge that comes out of that does not speak to our realities, does not share our experiences, and cannot speak to our day-to-day experiences as it pertains to the ecosystem we try to unpack. So you have to read Foucault, who talks about power and knowledge and the importance of recognizing that when we begin to ask important questions, we generate knowledge. And as we generate knowledge, it begins to give us transformative powers. And this is how our society becomes better. So I need you to be well-read. Being well-read is going to be critical, because I tell my students all the time, many of you are going to be scholars. Hopefully all of you are going to become scholars. And as scholars, you do a lot of writing. And oftentimes in the writing process, you run into what I call writing blocks. And we've all been there, where you just can't figure out what else to say because your brain is just cramped because you can't figure out what to type next in terms of your ideas or thoughts. Writing block is a real issue. But what is not an issue is reading blocks. So whenever I find myself having a writing block, I go back and I read. If I were to show you right now, right in front of me, I've got books on top of books on top of books that I constantly am reading whenever I get stuck. And this becomes my way to make sure that if I'm stuck, I can go to another piece of knowledge that can help me begin to understand how to become better. So becoming well-read is important. And as you do that, I need you to make sure that you're identifying and you're probing with critical theories, because your reading will help to inform the theories that you are going to use in your work. I think you have to begin to make sure that you are incorporating the ideas and the readings and the works of marginalized populations. I think we have to make sure we're thinking about theories that are seeped in ideas such as Black feminist thought, critical theory, critical race theory, indigenous methodologies, queer theory. I think we have to begin to look at the literature that comes from folks who are on the margins, because they have been raising important questions that the general mainstream knowledge has not thought about forever. And they're beginning to push, and they're beginning to challenge the existing paradigm. These kinds of works do what Thomas Kuhn says, is they help us to create new paradigms. And what's important is that we cannot begin to enforce those new paradigms if we continue to only cite the research of old white men. We have to cite women of color. We have to cite folks of color. We have to cite queer folks. We have to cite folks who are on the margin, because they are trying to raise questions and bring awareness and begin to bring new understanding to the circumstances that we see in our society today. So I need you to be well read. I need you to know about this work these are some of the works that I remember having to read when I was a graduate student. Race and Manifest Destiny by Reginald Horseman changed my whole outlook on the way I understood research. We had to read Race and Manifest Destiny, and it really helped me to understand the very way in which university presidents, university scientists, so-called recognized noted scientists of the day engaged in the construct of race and racism by using research to talk about the fact that the indigenous populations at the time were inferior, that folks who were of Mexican descent were inferior, that folks of African descent were inferior. And this is all done in the name of scientific inquiry. And this is why research that we do today is so important. So reading Race and Manifest Destiny for me was an eye-opener, because it let me know that these idioms, these theories that are steeped in really what I would call fake science, if we want to talk about something being fake science that led to the construction and the reification of these categories of seeing certain people as being inferior. So that's what we're trying to dismantle, these centuries of so-called works and research that's steeped in eugenics, steeped in craniometry, that talked about the brains and skulls of folks of color and women being smaller, so therefore they were not as intellectually gifted, all being done in the name of science. And we're trying to dismantle that. Gloria Anzaldúa is a must read for everybody, just as Bell Hooks is, because they begin to raise these important issues around gender and how we dismantle patriarchy as another system of oppression. So we have to find ways to engage in these works, even if we're not in fields such as education or history or ethnic studies or gender studies. I think that folks in medicine should be reading these works. I think that folks in the arts should be reading these works. I think that folks who are in urban planning should be reading these works. I think these works have utility across disciplines, because they begin to help us to develop a language, if you will, to begin to challenge our existing paradigms. I also need to look at these works as well. I need you to understand the work of James Banks and Lorraine Coe, where they talked about the knowledge construction process. I want to stress this point again, because the reason why you have to be well-read, that second point I raised, is because when you're well-read, you can begin to construct knowledge. And the construction of knowledge involves students, scholars critiquing the social positioning of groups through ways that knowledge is presented. And the knowledge that has been constructed for centuries in this country has not always boded well for the very groups I've been talking about. Part of what Banks and what Coe talk about is how do we begin to use race and class and gender to construct new bodies of knowledge told by folks of color, told by women, told by queer folks, in ways in which they get to be the authors of our own stories. So part of what I need you to know is that we are helping to build and construct knowledge so that in generations after us, they are not only left with the same, what I call outdated, antiquated, and sort of destructive ways of how they see us. So let me get ready to wrap up. I want to lead you with the last sort of approach I want us to look at, is that The third thing I want you to do is to understand that your methodological rigor is a must. So as you do this work, I want you to care about the topics that you care about. I need you to be well read. And the third thing is methods matter. Doesn't matter if you're doing quant research, qualitative research, do it well. Be well read on it. Understand the limitations of different types of methods. Understand the ways in which you can do this work in a rigorous way with depth and complexity that speaks to the issues that help us to understand what you're doing, whether you're doing historical inquiry, document analysis, observation, interviews, experimental designs. Do your research in ways that doesn't leave any stone unturned. There are no shortcuts in this work. We need to have work that is well done, that is asking probing questions, that gives us the ability to stand on sound science to disrupt so much of the distorted notions of who we are and how we've been portrayed historically. So I want you to make sure your methodological rigor is a must. So with that, I want to say thank you. I want to say thank you because I need you to remember that I want you to engage in this work to do good trouble, necessary trouble, good research, necessary research, research that is steeped in beginning to help sort of unpack some of the lies and distortions and misrepresentations of who we are as a people. And I need us to understand that our research will help to transform the way that we see ourselves and the way that the world sees us. I want to say that each and every one of you have a role to play. And I want to thank you for playing that role. I know that this work is oftentimes not exciting. It's not always fun. It's not always easy, but you're doing transformative work to help us create new paradigms, to help create a more just, humane, and inclusive society. And with that, I want to say thank you so much.